Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review, and this is session 5. All right, now, you have a note taker in front of you. What we're about to do in the first part of this note taker, you're not going to see this anymore. I developed this particular note taker so that you could hold on to the things that you have heard since we've started this review. So it is important that you kind of keep this page at a place where you're going back, you can review this page rather than all the pages of notes, because even, as of today, you'll have 30 pages of notes in a review. So it'd be better to take this, note taker to consolidate that down. So if you're ready to fill these in, let's go through this. And if there's a question about this before we move on, I'll ask you at the end and we'll address any of those questions. So here we go. God's purpose in creating man was to make His glory known. And now I didn't give you the verse that went with that last time, but look, here it is. And that He might make known the riches of His glory on the vessels of mercy which He had afore prepared unto glory. I'm just giving you the verse because I talked about that issue, but I didn't give you the verse on that. So that was His purpose in bringing mankind into the world all along. Here's the next one. I missed one. On your note taker, I guess I forgot to put it in here. The way God would make His glory known was the epitome of, do you have that there? Selflessness. Sorry, I guess I omitted that from the PowerPoint. Selflessness. God follows the curriculum. Actually, He is the curriculum. I shouldn't say He follows it. I should say the curriculum follows Him. But when He's asking us to be selfless, the very act of creation was a selfless act on His part for the benefit of the creation. And now, to make His glory known, God planned that man would become the beneficiary of all that God's grace and goodness could provide. And that is exactly what we need to have in our mind. That we are the beneficiaries of everything that an all-powerful God could bestow upon us. Number 2, we become sons of the living God, possessing our Father's wisdom. We'll talk about it in the next couple of items, but that's how He's going to make His glory known right there. Thirdly, we've become joint heirs with Jesus Christ and share in the riches of inheritance in the Father's business. Now you know these things, but what I'm trying to do is fold them all into what God was doing. Look, I'll say it to you this way. I didn't say it this way in the first 4 lessons. When I first talked with you about what God was doing when He created man, I was showing you all about sonship from our Father's perspective. Not from our perspective, from His perspective. And this is the unfolding of that. Next, to make His glory known, God planned that man would occupy a position of rulership and administration in the Father's business in the heavenly places. Yes, I'm talking about the dispensation of grace. We do realize there is going to be an earthly kingdom, and His program with Israel is going to, occupy positions of rulership and administration in the earth. We realize that. But we're talking about us as members of the body of Christ in the dispensation of grace. Next, God planned that man would participate in the privilege of determining the course for the Father's business in the ages to come. That is indeed a privilege. And I hope you remember what I'm talking about when I say that, because those sons that become men of understanding are actually going to be able to sit down with the Father, and the unfolding of what God is going to do and all of the successive ages are going to be determined by those that really possess that level of their Father's wisdom. Next, that God planned that man would enjoy an eternity that is constantly revealing greater and greater aspects of the Father's business, which the Son will be involved in. Nobody's going to get tired and nobody's going to get bored. And lastly, that God planned that man would experience the fullness of everything an intimate relationship with God can offer. And now moving off of that to the next one, it is by knowing all that we can know, by doing all that we have the capacity to do, and by becoming all that we may become, that we are observed to be to the praise of His glory. That is a very important. I need to take a minute and talk about that, because I don't want you to just see that. We'll finish this next line here. And that is how God intends to make His glory known. By us knowing some things and conducting ourselves in a particular way in accordance with what we know, and that in turn transforming us into the sons that we're supposed to be. That's how He makes His glory known. And if that's true, and it is, then you realize if we don't learn to think like our Father, if we don't learn to do things His way, if we never really become what He wants us to become as sons, you know what? The fullness of His glory cannot be observed. Do you see what we're doing when we decide to do that? If we decide, I'm not doing this, what you're really deciding at the end of this is that God's glory is not going to be known for all that it really is. And that should be a big deal to us. And I think it is. All right, so God is making His glory known God is not making His glory known by parading it in front of us. And when I talk about parading it, I'm talking about like some ostentatious display of look at me, look what I can do. I've got all this power. He's not doing it that way, nor by some miracle which a man may see. By the way, if there is anyone in the universe that's worthy of parading their power, it would be God. And if there's anyone in the universe that can actually supply a miracle, it would be God. But you do understand. Look, when I wrote this down to get it in your note taker, here's the thing that occurred to me. That if God is only making His glory known by some supernatural miracle where He suspends the natural laws, let's talk about walking on the water, or taking some loaves and fishes and feeding 5,000 people and having 12 basketfuls left over. Or we could talk about any of the other miracles that the Lord performed during His earthly ministry. Or the miracles that were performed for the nation of Israel, where they were great. Yes, the Red Sea parted and they went across on dry ground. Yes, the manna came every morning to sustain them. Yes, there was water that came from the rock when they were thirsty. Those were all miracles. That's true. But look, here's the point I'm trying to make. If God is going to make His glory known by those means, you know what? If you looked at Him for who He is, an omnipotent God, what else would you expect? That would be it, right?
Can I say something here? The miracles, and He's not performing miracles now.
Right.
And I understand that. But the miracles that were performed didn't seem to have the impact they should have, because look at how Israel failed. So this is a by far better way.
Thank you for that, because that's exactly where I'm going with this. The miracles, Clifford is saying, the miracles that were performed for Israel evidently didn't have the kind of lasting impact they were supposed to have, because look what happened to them in spite of all the miraculous things that were happening. I mean, just think about Jesus going about healing the sick and raising the dead and casting out devils, and a remnant believed in Him, but what did the religious leaders do? Well, they plotted to kill Him. Did it impact them? And here's the point. The miracle is an outward thing, and yes, I mean, a miracle is exactly that. But you know what God is doing by sonship? He's doing something in our heart that changes who we are. The miracle is an outward thing. Sonship is an inward thing. And when Clifford said that just then, that's exactly right. We have the more valuable... Does everybody see that? We have the more valuable thing. We're actually being changed, being conformed to the image of God's Son.
That's a miracle.
It is a more excellent way. And in that sense, that is a miraculous thing. That shows the greatest power that God possesses, the power of His grace to make that kind of transformation. Because a miracle couldn't, the miracle didn't do that. But this is the thing that really transforms us. And so that's what I'm saying here. God's not making His glory known by some display of show or by some miracle which a man may see. But to use that terminology, this is the more excellent way. This is what works in us to transform us. So God is making His glory known by putting this treasure in earthen vessels. That's out of Paul's epistles. And the earthen vessels, that's us. We're not the treasure, we're the vessels. Okay? The treasure is what He's doing, is what He's depositing in us. That's the treasure that transforms. Okay. Well, I'm really glad that you got... Does everybody see what we're talking about here? Okay, because look, I just say one more thing about it, because I just want to make sure we have this nailed down. Remember when we talked about how God is moving today, what He's not doing, and what the work He is doing is in our inner man. And remember the old days, we thought if God's not doing something in our outward circumstances, God's not doing anything. What He's doing is actually the more important work. He's doing the greater work. But see, the way people look at God and their Christian life today, they would rather have God miraculously do something than have Him transform them in their inner man, because they don't realize the value of that. That is the greater thing. And so my point in bringing that up is to say that treasure has an eternal value to it. That once the miracle is done, the next time you run into something, you know what you'll want? Another miracle. Instead, He's doing... Okay, so now let me move us on. And by doing so, God makes man into something that surpasses even the highest of the angels in every way. And right now, physically we do not, but when we get our glorified body, even in that way, we will do that. We will surpass even the angels. This is a pretty special thing. Next, God's glory is made known by what we become as His sons and daughters. And folks, that's why this is a big deal. This is why the demands that it makes on us is worth the time and the effort. And when I say over and over again, we've got to take this and put it into our life when we leave this place. We've got to begin thinking about it when we leave this place, because what we actually become, is how God is going to make His glory known. That's the only way He is going to do it. Now, the way in which God has chosen to make His glory known is all to our benefit. His glory is going to be made known, but it's going to be because something very special has happened in us. What happened in the Garden of Eden disqualified every man from being a recipient of all God wanted to bestow upon him. But God sent His Son so that His original plan might still be fulfilled. That everything He wanted to do with a man out in eternity is still going to happen. And so I put those together because I just didn't want to isolate the disqualifying in the Garden of Eden without putting God's remedy for that right up there with it. So what we have is, when we trusted in Christ, we were given everything we needed. And that's justification and sanctification. I realize our exaltation is not in that list, but we're not really looking at that yet justification and sanctification to again qualify to receive all that God originally wanted to give us as His sons. So what God did by giving us that justification and sanctification qualified us to be the recipients of all that God originally intended. Okay. In order to fulfill all that God has given us the potential to be, we must engage with our Heavenly Father in an education that is meant to result in edifying us as His sons. So I'm putting both elements of the education and the edification together there. The education starts the process, edification is the end result of that process. Every part of that education is meant to produce something in us. And that means in just a moment when we learn the next parts of what we're doing in justification, that is meant to produce something in us. And I'm not going to leave you in the dark as to what that is. I'm going to show you exactly what knowing the things in Romans 1 through 5 is supposed to produce in you. And then you'll be able to look and see, is that happening? And because it's an education, there are things, I left out the word be, to be learned, which transforms our thinking, and then applied, which transforms our conduct and behavior and results in an edification. Okay, now we're getting close to the end. The gospel of Christ has 3 parts to it, and we learned this. The first one was an awareness of God's wrath. If people are going to be saved, they're going to have to know that there is going to be wrath for sin. Secondly, a worthiness of God's wrath. And the third one is, God has made a provision so that men might escape His wrath. There's the 3 parts to the gospel. Leaving any of those out is an insufficient presentation of the gospel. So there's those 3 parts. And we're talking about those. In fact, we've already talked about an awareness of God's wrath. When we got to the second part, the worthiness, that everyone is worthy of God's wrath, immediately when men hear that, you know what they begin to do? They begin to make excuses. We've covered 2 of those excuses so far. The first one is relative righteousness. These are all in the second part of the gospel. This is what men do when they hear that they're worthy of God's wrath. They try to figure out a way to make it so that they're not worthy of God's wrath. So the first thing they do in relative righteousness, anybody know what that is? What is relative righteousness? Someone give me a... Yeah, they're comparing themselves with someone else. I'm not as bad as so-and-so. There are really bad people in this world. Yeah, they deserve to be punished, but not me. I haven't done those things. And then what we understand is it doesn't matter if you're really, really bad or if you're really, really not so bad. Any of those things that Paul mentions back in Romans 1 make you worthy of death. Because the only way is to get it right every single time and never miss. All right, now here's the second one. And this is the one we left off on. Excuses for a Gentile. So and there was a thing here that the Gentiles said, oh look, because I'm a Gentile, God did not give me the law. And so He gave that to Israel. It's not fair to judge me by the law because I never had the law. So God's being unfair by judging me. So Paul's going to come along and say, you know what, God didn't give you the law. That's true. But you do have something. You have a law that is written in your heart by nature. And let me show you the verses on this, because this is exactly where we left off. Romans 2:13, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. By the way, he's not talking about just keep the law and you get justified. We just came out of the verses that talked about being absolutely perfect in keeping the law. If you did that, yeah, you could justify yourself. But no man can do that. Verse 14, for when the Gentiles, which have not the law, see, Paul says, sure, you didn't get the law, do by nature the things contained in the law. He says, you do those kinds of things anyway. I'll give you one out of the law. Thou shalt not steal. Right? And you know what? Even the Gentiles without the law, what do they know? They know that if you take something that doesn't belong to you, that's wrong. And Gentiles who set up governments not under God, you know what they have? They have laws against stealing because they know. Laws against murder because they know. He says those things, they do by nature the things contained in the law. These Gentiles, having not the law, I'm sorry, not Gentiles, these things that they have by nature in them, these having not the law, are a law unto themselves. He says, you know what? You have a code of conduct that says, this is wrong and this is right. And so God says, and so here's what I'm going to do. You didn't know the law of Moses, but you do have a code of conduct, so I'm going to judge you on your own code of conduct. Uh-oh. Because no Gentile got that right every time either. Now, you know what? Look, I know it's just a review, but I want to take 30 seconds and talk about one question. Well, if people knew right and wrong without the law, why give the Jews the law? Paul is actually going to come along later and make a statement and said, I had not known sin except for the law. And he said, but wait, here he says, Gentiles who didn't get the law, they had a code of what was right and wrong. They knew some things. But you know what? Here's what Paul is talking about. The more you knew the law, the more you understood how unrighteous you really were. And you were unrighteous about things that you didn't naturally know. The law shined a bright light on it, and you saw really the way you were. Gentiles didn't have that bright light, but they had enough. So here's the last verse that I'll give you on this before we move on. Oh, you've got a note taker piece. I'm sorry. Gentiles did know their own laws, and yet they could not keep them. That's the thing you need to get out of this excuse that is particular to a Gentile. God is going to show the Gentiles to be the sinners that they are on the basis of their own laws. Doesn't have to be the law of Moses. They have broken their own laws. And that is the law. I talked about something happening in our heart earlier. Take a look at this. Because here's how Paul is going to talk about it. Romans 2:15. Which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. He goes, you guys know what's right and wrong. You're either accusing or excusing, you're going through this. He said, but you know what? There's something in you that you know, and your conscience also bearing witness. How many times have we done something and our conscience bothered us about it? You know what? Even if you didn't have the law, that would have happened. Can a man sear his conscience to where he doesn't care? He can. He can. But he has to get there. That's not the way he comes into the world. Okay, I'm not touching that. Okay. So, Paul is saying, really, it's not necessary to give the Gentiles the law. It's still right. Now let's talk about the next excuse. The next excuse is the extenuating circumstances because I'm a Jew. See, the Gentile thought he had a loophole. The Jew thinks he has a loophole. And so what we're going to find out is the Jew thinks, now let me just sum this up for you. The Jew thinks that because he is a Jew, because he's of the seed of Abraham, he is naturally righteous and naturally holy. So why in the world did God give them the law? Here's what the Jew thinks. God gave us Jews the law so we could show the Gentiles what bad sinners they are. That wasn't for us because we don't need it. Because we're Jews. That's really what they're thinking. So, here's your note taker. The Jew will say the reason God gave Israel the law was not because they needed it. But God gave Israel the law for the rest of the world because the Jews were not sinners, the Gentiles were. And that's the way every Jew would think about that. And so when it came to being worthy of God's wrath, you know what they thought? We're exempt. He's not talking about us. And you say, well, He gave you the law. They say, yeah, but He gave us the law for us. He gave us the law for those Gentiles. They're the bad ones. We're supposed to show them how bad they are. Because there's nothing wrong with us. Let me show you this thing that Paul writes in Galatians, because they have trouble with this law thing too. Look at this, Galatians 2:15. We who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. That's exactly the way they think about it. Gentiles are sinners. Jews, we're naturally righteous. We're naturally holy. I guess that's why they crucified their Messiah. Go back to Romans chapter 2. Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God. And indeed they did. But notice, the Jew is going to think, God's not going to pour His wrath out on me because I'm of the seed of Abraham. That's not for me. Now let's pick it up in verse 18. And knowest His will, and approvest things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which has the form of knowledge and the truth in the law. He says, this is how you're thinking. By the way, when he says you Jews think that you're a guide of the blind, who's the blind? I mean, who do the Jews think the blind are? Yeah, they think the Gentiles. A light of them which are in darkness. He says, you Jews think you're a light to those Gentiles. You think you're a guide to the Gentiles because they're blind and you're not. An instructor of the foolish. See, now they're saying, that's how you think of the Gentiles. They're foolish. A teacher of babes. That's how you think of the Gentiles. They're just babes. You guys are the light. You're the guides. You're everything great. And Paul's going to lower the bombshell on them. Verse 21. Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Oh, you got to stop and think about that. And then he says, thou sayest a man should not commit adultery. Dost thou commit adultery? I'm actually going to take you to somewhere in the Scripture for this real quickly. But look, I remember, let's talk about the world just for a second. I'm talking religion, not politics here. If I say Sharia law, does everybody understand what that is? Sharia law, look, there is, in the religion of Islam, there are many who want to set up a caliphate, which will be a geographical area from which they will operate their religion throughout the world and convert the world. Now, in a sense, wanting to convert the world is not so different from what Christians want to do. The only difference is we're not cutting people's heads off who decide not to convert. God is going to sort out all the judgment on that. But here's my point. There was one of the leaders of the ISIS group was actually educated in this country and was a big promoter of Sharia law. Sharia law says that, and again, I don't want to take too much time on this. Sharia law says that girls can't get an education. Sharia law says that a woman cannot go anywhere by herself. She must be accompanied by a male relative. She has to have her face covered. she can't, she's not going to participate in the normal things that women in this country would participate in. There is also the moral side of Sharia law. Sharia law would say that a man should not commit adultery. But the particular individual, and we'll talk about this one time and I'll name the name for you, but for the sake of this, it's not important, but this particular ISIS leader now, who was educated in this country, actually left this country because he was discovered to be visiting the houses of ill repute over and over and over. So you know what he was actually doing? While they are killing people elsewhere who violate Sharia law, they are hypocritically violating their own law. The very leaders are violating the law for which they are killing other people. Which, if you were going to be consistent, you would need to go ahead and chop your own head off. But they're not going to do that. You know why? Because consistency is not it. Control is the issue. It doesn't matter if... So you know what? You left this country, but you know what? That still came out. And it's all documented. The only reason I bring that up is to say that's the very question that's being asked to the Jew here. You know what? You say the law says not to steal, and you have the law. So Paul is saying, so I'm going to ask you, do you steal? Because what he's trying to get the Jew to understand is, you're not naturally righteous. You do the same things that you call the Gentiles sinners over. You're doing the same thing. I'll take you to this. John chapter 8, verse 1. Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that she should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. What's interesting to me is they said this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Jesus is doing something here, but my question is, then where's the man? Because if she's caught in the act, then you also caught the man. I really believe he's one of them. But you know what? They're not going to bring anything about him to the Lord. They're going to bring the woman. And if Jesus says stone her, then you know what they're going to say? He sides with us. If he says don't stone her, well, the law. Now you're contradicting the law. You know what? Jesus understands what's going on with that. So we're going to skip to verse 7 here. That's verse 6. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said to them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience. The only time you get convicted is when you're guilty. That's the point Jesus is trying to make with them. And of course they went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last, and Jesus was left alone and the woman standing in the midst. The only thing I'm trying to say is that's exactly the point that Paul is making to the Jew. While you pretend to be so righteous, guess what? You do the same things that you accuse the Gentiles of. There is no real difference between you. Yeah, you have the law, but you're just like them. So now let me take you back to where we left off. He says, don't steal or commit adultery. And we'll take it up verse 22. Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law, dishonorest thou God? Let me ask you a question. How many Jews at one time or another broke the law? Every one of them. He's going to say, you mean by breaking the law you're not dishonoring God? How is that? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. You know what he's saying? You're just like the Gentiles. That was a statement that poked the hornet's nest. But he's telling them exactly how that is. So, when Paul's doing away with this Jewish excuse and showing them to be exactly what, take a look at what he says now in verse 29. But he is a Jew which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, talking about the law, whose praise is not of men, but of God. Here, this is the issue once again. It's not outward circumcision, it's the circumcision of the heart. Something is really happening to you. You're being transformed. That would start, of course, with believing that Jesus was the Christ. That law was supposed to produce something in them as well. Now, there is something I want to say about this. Did I turn that off already? Okay, let me just take a second and do this because I'm going to be right on schedule here. There is one last excuse that let me just do it like this. We're going to get to a place when we get into sanctification. I know you're already kind of aware of it, but I'm just going to bring it up because Paul is talking about this. And we're going to find out that there's two ways to do what men would normally call good works. We will do them in the power of our flesh, or we will do them in the power of grace. There's only two ways to do what we think of as good works. If it's done in the flesh, God does not consider that to be a good work at all. And what we're going to discover is how to know when we're operating out of our flesh and how to know when we're operating out of grace. It's going to be a very simple test, and we'll be able to discern everything. Honestly, folks, this is the last thing I'll say in this session. This is at the very heart of what it means to live for God. This requires a sermon that most churches truly would be unwilling to hear as a whole. I think individuals in many churches would hear it and respond, but at large, most churches would reject this because what that means is most of the things, look, you know how, I'll tell you how I used to preach sermons, that I would motivate people to do good things. I'd read verses in the Scripture. I mean, it was an honest attempt on my part, but you know what? All of that was being manufactured out of what they would do. And so that was all works that were manufactured out of our flesh. How in the world do you distinguish from works that come from here from works that come from here if the works look just the same? Because the works that are done out of the power of God's grace come out of the doctrine or the godly wisdom of your Heavenly Father that He produces in you. There's another way to say this, and again, I'm not trying to give you a full treatment on it. When we get into sanctification, we'll see this clearly. I believe that this is probably one of the most important messages that Christians today need to be aware of. I got to tell you, I came all the way up through school. I never heard this one time. All the way through Bible college, I never heard it. I don't know how many years I was in the ministry. I never heard it. I just thought I just needed to do the right thing and do good things. What I didn't realize was, and I would have taken umbrage at it if someone had said, everything that you're doing counts for nothing because you're producing it, not your Father. And I'd be going, well, I'm doing it for Him. That's what I've honestly said. But you can do it for Him out of your flesh, which He will reject, or you can do it, you could call this, living out of the Spirit. Actually, we're going to get that term when we get over there. That's really close to what's being talked about here. Because who's a real Jew? It's not one who's the seed of Abraham. It's one who is a Jew inwardly. Karen?
We've been talking about sonship, and I usually say in the flesh is working for God. With grace, you're working with God as an adopted son.
That's right. That's correct. I understand that. I think that's right.
Because of the servant versus the son. And all
True. All of that, right. I think that's true. So the point I'm trying to get to here is that it's not in the letter for them. It's not in just following the law. There has to be something more than that. And the same is true for us. It's not just I'm doing a bunch of good works. But this has to be actually something that grace is producing in you. Does that make sense? I may have raised a few more questions than I actually answered there, but we are... Huh?
Are you going into more details on that?
I am. Not right now, but we absolutely are going to do the details of that. Because that's part of the review that I think is critical, that we really understand the difference in that. And we'll lay that out very clearly. In fact, I'm really looking forward to that because I'm thinking that I'm actually going to take the notes that we use to cover that, and I think we may transform that into a booklet and make that available so that at least when folks don't like us, they'll know why. Okay, so we'll stop here, we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up the last excuse, and then we'll move into the third part